This is Real World Product Management. Hello, everyone. This is another episode of the Real World Product Management, and I have Jon Janego. Am I pronouncing your name right?
Yep.
Okay. So, Jon is here with us today. Thank you so much. Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Jon Janego. I'm a product manager for a company called Veracode, based in Chicago, Illinois.
Thank you. We don't have a very specific agenda, so it won't be like some of our previous episodes where we only talked about data-driven decisions or very specific presentation and do the Q&A. We just want to explore with Jon his career path. I think there are some interesting things that he's seen that personally I've never seen before, and he has a very interesting experience being product manager in his company, and he has a really interesting experience continuously going to the market with some of the things. So those are things I'd like to explore today. So Jon, why don't we start with going on a high level through your career path?
Sure.
How do you become a product manager? How did you become a product manager? What brought you here, and what are you doing?
Yeah. Okay. Like everybody or most people in the field, I don't think that there's a real front door, and so it's not unusual for me to say that I feel like I came in the side door also. So I've worked at this company called Veracode for almost 7 years now. Prior to that, I worked in a consulting role in a couple in a boutique firm, and before that I worked in a large company. So throughout my career I've done a lot of interesting technical work, and gradually started moving towards more consultative services, and joined Veracode in a consultative services based role. And after about 2 years of doing that, there was an opening on the product management team that I pursued, and I feel like I talked my way into it, and the rest is history, I suppose. I've been doing it for close to 4.5 years now, and has been an interesting ride with some acquisitions, and seeing our company transition from a late stage startup to a more middle-aged startup, I suppose, is kind of the state that we're in at this point, and a couple spots in the middle.
So you mentioned, Jon, sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure I get this out of you
Sure.
in this episode. You mentioned that your startup was acquired here and there.
Yeah.
And I see this as a really interesting challenge for a product manager, given that you stayed, given that well, first of all, you kept your job, and second, the companies that were acquiring your startup, kept the role.
Yeah.
Although my understanding is with the acquisition, first thing is to change is the business direction or business goals.
Yeah.
So I would love for you to uncover that, because I've never been in that situation.
Yeah.
If you could just walk me through, maybe just overview of the challenges that you as a product manager experienced through these acquisitions, through this process.
Sure. Well, so I think something that everybody in product management at least should be keeping in mind is sort of the overall business strategy that your company is in terms of, what's the CEO thinking about, and, how are your decisions as a PM, whether it's for a whole product portfolio or managing individual features within a product, going to contribute to that business strategy. And, when I started at Veracode in 2013, and when I started on the PM team in 2015, we are very much in the late stage of a startup. We are funded by venture capital, and we're on the track of the typical VC startup trajectory where the number one metric the VCs are paying attention to is growth. Not terribly focused on profitability, not terribly focused on anything other than growth as an overall metric. And that had been informing the company's decisions, as it informs many startup companies' decisions in terms of the product priorities that they take. For various reasons, the startup stage of our company effectively ended by being acquired by a very large software company, which was an unexpected but not actually that terrible of an outcome, to be honest with you.
Not great, not terrible.
Well, everything's got pros and cons, I suppose. But I think as a whole, it turned out to be pretty benign, I'll say. But I think one thing that was good about it, and the company that acquired us, a company called CA Technologies, it's one of the largest software companies in the world. It's been around for decades, and they were very progressive in terms of their approach to acquisitions. They were acquiring high growth businesses and basically funding them to continue on that growth trajectory and to gradually start nudging them towards the path of becoming a more stable part of the overall company portfolio. And so in many respects, our point of view as a startup didn't change all that much when we were acquired, because our acquirer basically said, here, we're invested in your success. We just paid, a decent amount of money for you, and, you guys keep doing you. We're not going to mess with you, as long as you keep up your growth plans and, figure out a way to, make this a mutually beneficial type of thing. What we didn't see coming was that about a year and a half after we were acquired, CA itself was acquired by a much larger company called Broadcom, which made the news as being one of the largest all-cash acquisitions in history. Also made the news because Broadcom is traditionally a hardware company acquiring an all-software company. So it was very odd, I suppose, for lack of a better term. And it was especially odd for us in the part of CA who had been on the acquiree side, because we'd been kind of doing our thing, and unexpectedly had this large hardware company as our potential new owner. And long story short, they decided they didn't want anything to do with any of the, these startup-y parts of the CA business, and spun us and several other parts of the business out. We ended up being sold by Broadcom to a private equity firm, who is now our financial backing. So for those of you who may have heard about private equity and, kind of has a bit of sometimes a negative connotation to it. Our experience with private equity, and our firm is Thoma Bravo. It's one of the largest PE firms in the world. And they've been excellent. They've been very positive and only good things from my perspective. But one thing that all PE firms share in common is they're focused on profitability and focused on getting a solid return in a relatively narrow time frame compared to those in venture capital world. We had typical VC investors going on timescale of 8+ years, whereas private equity looks at things generally from the 4 to 5 year lens. and after those 4 to 5 years, they may continue on with the investment, but they want to see progress in 4 to 5 years. So this is a long meandering way to talk about orienting the company from focused on growth as the prime metric driver to focus on both growth and profitability. And if you have to pick between the two, you try and balance them, but profitability is still a really important thing to take into consideration. So
No, it made sense. Sorry, it made sense for me that you went all this way to explain, kind of like tell a bit of a history, because it makes sense in terms of your responsibilities as a product manager to kind of address like, hey, this is why we stopped caring about A and started caring about A and B.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for me personally, it hasn't made a lot of changes in the way that I've looked at the product roadmap and sort of think about the strategy for our portfolio. But I think it's important to keep that in mind at the business scale level in terms of, think about, if I have to pick one or the other, what do I optimize for? And also thinking about that time frame, because, in the VC world or in the startup world, it's sometimes a little ambiguous, what your goals are, what the time frame in terms of like an exit horizon is. At least it can be ambiguous unless you're part of the executive team. And even within that executive team, it's sometimes, it's not always completely, everyone's not always completely aligned on it sometimes. And within this situation, everyone kind of is on the same page of, we're trying to make the company as grow as much as we can and keep it as profitable as we can. Which I think overall it's nice to have that clarifying, where you stand type of thing.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I agree with you. It's always nice to know where you're going with this, and especially when you're talking to C-level execs and you're trying to understand. So what is it that we're doing again?
Yeah, exactly. And I'd worked at a startup before that like was acquired like a couple months after I left, and it had never been spoken of, frankly, like what the plan was, from a liquidity perspective, and so I think, I was probably a little naive about it, but at the same time, it's like once you've been through an acquisition or, a couple acquisitions, you start learning a little bit about like the business aspect of it in terms of, this is how these things go. And this is what you need to be thinking about in terms of, in terms of if you have to optimize for one or two things, here's what you should really be focusing on, because that's what the people who are paying you are really focused on, or the people funding you rather,
Well, paying for you or funding you.
Yeah,
same thing.
Well, okay, our customers pay for us, but the equity firm is the one funding us.
Oh, I see. Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's an important distinction, and I agree with you. makes sense. All right, so having said all that, and you mentioned that at some point after the first acquisition, your job or your focus didn't change much, but then at the second one it did.
Yeah, it did. It did a little bit. I think I have the pretty luxurious position of having of having a pretty strong performing product. I'll say some of the things that I observed just through the course of acquisition was there's changes in the company, and just from a personnel perspective, and you also learn about your coworkers. I don't know, things that you may not have otherwise learned about them. I guess I'll suppose is one way to say it. Just in terms of, people's attitude towards work, people's tolerance for risk, that kind of thing. Some people are more comfortable working in startups, and after an acquisition, just want to leave. They consider the exit to be, the prize, and then go to the next opportunity to do it. Some people are more interested in building the long-term, thing, and then other people are justifiably a little unsure about what to do, what this all means for them on a personal level too, when you see these type of things happening. So it's it's an interesting shared experience that I think I learned a lot about myself and a lot about just business, I guess, just having been a part of and paying attention to it, and as I want to be realistic, a product manager is not like a critical person at the negotiating table when these things are happening. But I think
in a way,
I wasn't negotiating our exit or anything like that. But
right,
working in this part of the business, you have a little bit of a wider angle perspective on
yes, absolutely,
on things. So you get to empathize with those how those negotiations happen, and can think about it sort of like maybe this actually is the best thing for us, or whatever, which other parts of the business you may not think about those, or if you think about them, it's not as part of your life. It's not as part of your job. It's like, it's my responsibility to think about these as part of my job. So it's been an interesting learning experience that I'm glad to have been a part of, for sure.
I can somewhat relate to that, and again, somewhat being the key word here. I was present in some of the negotiations, not at the exit, but at the partnership negotiations. I was somewhat present, again, not on all of them, and it was definitely an eye-opening experience. Yeah. So for the folks who don't participate, the folks that are not present. Everything seemed to be very shady, and what I've learned is my personal view on that. Nothing is what it seems. Absolutely nothing you think that's going on there is going on there. It's like a completely different picture. Whatever you've imagined yourself, it's not what you think.
Yeah.
This is one of those cases when it's totally not what you think. There are other things that are happening, but not what you think.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I would add on to that, if anybody is in a startup that and seeing this kind of thing happen, or experiencing it themselves, would be like, don't take anything personally that goes on, whether it's at the large scale level, like if your company is acquired, great, or if it's at the personal level, like, your boss can't tell you about what they're doing on their last business trip, like that's just how it is, there, especially when it comes to, high stakes financial transactions, there are laws and there are rules, and there's a lot of people's livelihoods tied up in it. So people are often operating under some pretty strict things that they can and cannot say, just so they don't screw it up,
Yep.
Like you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of other people's monies.
Yep.
So one tweet by a PM who heard about something could screw up the whole deal, so it's business, man,
Yep. No, I agree with you completely that on that front. A lot of things can go wrong, and sometimes they do if you're not careful who you say, who you talk to, what you say, how you say it.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. That was really interesting, and thank you for sharing that. That it's not every day you get as a PM you get to sit at the higher table.
Yeah.
And I always appreciate somebody sharing what was their experience, because I didn't have that much of mine. I mean, not all the time. So I think this is a good time to switch gears a little bit and talk about the actual products that you worked on, because I think there's a story there about what went well, what went wrong. How can we, leverage that knowledge for the good of mankind as the whole, and product managers particularly.
Sure. Well, so I can talk a little bit about the products I work on and our company as a whole. First off, so Veracode is an application security testing company. We sell software to other companies to help them test for security issues. We have we have 6 parts of the product portfolio, and I manage one of those products, which is our oldest one. It's called static analysis, and it's, without sounding like tooting our horn about it, I'll say, we're one of the most successful companies in the space by a number of metrics. We have pretty solid growth. We have a large number of users, good opinions of us with the analyst community, and happy customers and stuff. So it's an interesting business to be in. Information security as a whole is an interesting business, and application security in particular is an interesting business.
Let's focus more on products and on your experience working within the portfolio.
Yeah.
So as a person who did all of the above, I'm really curious to see, or to hear rather, how you guys manage your portfolio, being the individual product managers on individual products. How do you synchronize your efforts, if there is synchronization required, or do you guys run in each of you running in your own separate directions, with the hope that 20 years later we're going to meet somewhere down the line?
I'll say that we have a high level product portfolio level vision that we're still executing, but the individual product teams within them is sort of a parallel play type of thing. If you've got toddlers, the phrase, and that you're kind of doing your own thing in the same sandbox, and sometimes you hand a toy off between the two of you, but oftentimes it's kind of you're moving the same general direction, but doing your own thing. And a lot of that is just from frankly a technology perspective. We have our market is segmented fairly into a few different product categories, which have some degree of technology overlap, but not often a lot of it. So as an individual product team, there's frankly not a lot of overlap between something that like the core team of one product versus another is working on. Instead, what our one of our core portfolio differentiators is that we have a single platform through which you can access or interface with all of the different testing solutions that we offer. So that sort of serves as that connective tissue between the various parts of the product portfolio. But the teams that I'm working with, is primarily, focused on, doing our core static analysis business, and doing it deep, and not overlapping with a lot of our colleagues doing their own businesses, I'll say.
It makes sense. And it makes sense in the larger or grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
It makes sense because that's what I've seen in most of the and I'm talking about different industries, not just your particular niche or my particular niche. It just seemed to be the smart thing to do when you're not kind of cannibalizing your own customers, your own audience. So if you're, I've only seen one company that kind of stood up two product teams and had one company support legacy product and another company literally was off to the races to cannibalize the existing market from the legacy product in a, I don't want to call it a hostile manner, but it was kind of because of the personalities that were behind those products. It was more or less hostile matter. It was kind of like, no, we're going to take over your customers. We don't care about you. And the team was really, and weirded out, if that's the word.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like it'd be a fun place to work. That's for sure. If
was not
competing with your teammates,
there were other teams, so it was not, and it kind of, it was kind of unintentional, but I have a feeling it was not entirely unintentional. It was kind of like C-level execs gathered in the corner office, had a bottle of wine or something, were like conversating, and one of them said, hey, listen, wouldn't that be nice if we kind of like try to introduce both products and see which one is better? And the other one would say, yeah, sure, that sounds like a great idea. And they did exactly like they said.
I mean, there could be a certain amount of brutal efficiency to that, but it may not be the most pleasant place to be working, I'll say. So it takes a certain type of people, a certain type of person to want to do that. Sounds stressful.
Yep. It was.
I mean, what I'll say is, to add on to some of, what you're asking, like as an organization, in spite of our teams working, fairly independent of each other, we've been trying to align more closely, at least, institution, or I guess, process wise, because of having this shared portfolio or the shared platform layer and a fairly complicated product technologically speaking, there are often cross team dependencies and things that kind of can come up and let one team block the other inadvertently. So one of the things that we've been trying to do in the last couple years has been to be a bit more organized as an engineering and product team level in terms of identifying those and playing together in a big group, because we have a pretty large engineering team. We have about 250 engineers or so, and a relatively small product management team, about 10 people, but still it's a fairly big organization to manage across. And so one of the things our team has been has rolled out is the scaled Agile framework, which has been interesting. I think I know it has its fans and it has its detractors. I'm kind of ambivalent about it, honestly. I mean, I think my observation has been that it's been good to have neutral mediators in the form of essentially like the project managers, trying to look at the team at what we call the portfolio level and identify cross team dependencies and helping us roll out processes, because if it's being rolled up by one team onto another team, that sometimes there's, some feeling of, who are you to tell me what I'm supposed to do type of thing. And, having a neutral person or a neutral team in the middle helping roll it out, for the benefit of the organization has been very helpful. And then, other sort of maybe what might seem like mundane things, but important things like having having our sprint calendars be consistent between different Scrum teams and consistent, naming practices and amongst our releases and, things like that, that, you can overcome those on a case by case basis. But, as the organization scales and, as, people move in and people move out of the company and stuff, it's helpful to have, some consistent processes that are not just like institutional knowledge, but are instead just something that's defined and, everybody's kind of following.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm not, I'm not a fan. Okay, that comes out wrong. I'm not a proponent of scaled agile.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more of I like instruments. I like to apply instruments where they belong. So if a team is large enough, and I think you mentioned 250 engineers, scaled agile makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
We actually implemented a scaled down version of scaled agile, and I know how that sounds, for a way smaller team with the purpose of scaling up.
Yeah.
So it was done with purpose, so that exactly like you said, so that it's not an institutional knowledge. It's a standard processes that are implemented within the delivery or engineering organization with the purpose of, no matter how many people there are, 5, 10, 2 teams, 5 teams, 20, 30 teams, it would be still the same process. And scaled agile is really good at that because it works on a small level and it scales up really well, which is why they called it that.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and, I think the other big advantage I've observed with it has been that, for better or worse, it's documented. It's there's not a single, there's not like a template of how you roll out Agile. But if you're looking for a template, scaled Agile is one of the few that actually has processes around it. So
yes.
If you know that you need to do better at Agile, you could go a couple directions. You find a freelance Agile coach, you find a couple solid Scrum Masters who've done it before, or you could find, some coaches who have rolled out a process like scaled Agile and then, use that as a guiding principle and flex it to whatever matches your organization, and I'm not an Agile coach or I frankly don't care. I care most about getting products out consistently and, predictably, but, it's not a religion. It's just something that you got to use to make to serve the ultimate goal. So it's not wrong or right. It's just you got to be organized, and it's hard to be organized if you don't have a template to go from sometimes.
Yeah, I think what you were trying to say at the beginning is that the good part about the scaled agile is not that it's documented, is that it's documented outside of your organization. So you can always refer to it when a new person comes in. You can say, "Hey, this is what we're doing." You don't have it's not like we're doing our own thing.
Yeah,
it's just one of the public things that we're doing, and it makes sense.
And like if there's ever one thing I've read about in other organizations is like title inflation or ambiguities about what titles mean or that kind of thing. And, at least, again, like as long as you're not too zealous about it, you can say, well, generally, if you're looking at what does a Scrum Master do versus what does a product owner do versus what a product manager do, the scaled Agile definitions are a good starting point for that, versus but sometimes, you can be interviewing candidates and, their definition of what they did may have very small relation with what your definition of what you expect that, role to be, so.
Yep. I can't. This is the part where I agree with my guest. This is not what I intended, but it's good to agree on certain things sometimes.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. Let me get back to you. Let me get back at you.
Yeah.
Since you've mentioned product owners and product managers.
Yeah.
And I'm always curious to see how your organization defines those roles. Like, is there a difference? Is there a similarity?
Yeah.
Is there an overlap? Tell me.
It's complicated. I think we have had uneven rollout of product ownership roles, I'll say. And I think part of it is, our company has a very, very strong engineering culture. It's a really technical product, and it's got a really very strong core engineering team and a lot of desire to keep a sort of a light touch between the product management organization and the engineering organization in terms of like defining what, how the pieces get built, so to speak. So the product owner roles, we don't have POs for every single team. And the POs that we have, are kind of play closer to a junior PM role to some degrees in terms of defining the overall, making those day-to-day prioritization decisions about stories. But it really just depends on the team. It's hard to generalize just because, I'm talking about like 8 or 10 different Scrum teams, and so it's a little bit different from every team.
So you would say in every team you have a slightly different scope for the product owner role? Is that what it is?
So the product owner roles that we have align more with the overall product portfolio and are working with multiple Scrum teams in the same way that a PM is working with multiple Scrum teams. The difference from a day-to-day basis is that ultimately the PM gets the final decision in terms of the priorities, can cast the tie-breaking vote. POs do more day-to-day story writing and, sprint, working with the Scrum Masters for sprint planning purposes. And, we try and stay pretty tightly aligned. It's a little bit more like co-PMing, to some degree, but I'll just say like our organization is relatively small. The PM organization is relatively small, especially compared to the size of the overall engineering organization that we're working with. So we kind of just we try and work as make product owner role be as much of a force multiplier as it can be, because like for example, like I work with 5 separate Scrum teams, and sometimes they have stand up at the same time, so, the PO will be at some of them and I'll be at some of the other ones, or that kind of thing,
You mean the PO would have to be on the same 5 teams?
Sometimes, but, or we'll split between different teams doing different, depending on what needs to be done for that given week or that given sprint or the stage of the product release that we're at or what have you.
Makes sense. So your PO is not really a team member. Your PO is more like a junior product manager who cares. Well, let's maybe dramatize this a little. Your PO cares more about the product than he does for a team.
Yeah, I mean the product owner works on the product management team, not on the engineering team. So
got it.
Ultimately, they're representing the product management team's point of view rather than the engineering team's point of view.
Got it. Okay.
And that's not to position as adversarial, but it's like that tension that's always present and hopefully healthy between engineering and strategy teams.
Right, and then that's the good part, because if and we've seen this in let's say I've seen this in my engagements when IT becomes order takers. They have no say in what to do, and they end up not having a say in how to do things.
Yeah.
So they can be and actually end up facing technological challenges that are impossible to resolve. Like, build this with this, build me, make me a shovel out of sand, and you're looking at this like, what?
Yeah.
And this is interesting because in my head, in my experience, in my product mindset that I kind of advocate, product owner is a role on the Scrum team. So product owner is an interface of the team, between the team and the product management team, or between the team and the business, but they're part of the team. They're not a part of the product management. Yeah. They have, intimate knowledge of a product. They have intimate knowledge of technology. But in my product mindset, my meaning, what I advocate for, they're on the other side of the fence. And it's interesting to see how you guys are still successful, which basically tells me, it's not the part where I agree with you. It's not a religion. It's just, whatever the right tool is for the job. And if it works for you, then, there's truth to it.
Well, it's not like it's all roses, and I'm definitely not here saying all the great things that we're doing and all of that, but it seemed, it's worked okay. I mean, I think it was a subject of much debate when because product owner is a relatively new role within our organization. Once upon a time, it was only PMs. And then we worked with engineering managers as the day-to-day product owners, effectively. So when we decided to start hiring product owners, it was a subject of much debate between the product management leadership team and the engineering leadership team about where those individuals would be reporting into. As it turned out, and in this case, the POs ended up reporting into the PM organization. But I'll say, the PO role is, still needs to be a close ally and partner of the engineering team, probably closer than the PM needs to be, because, where there's been challenges with various product owner roles I've seen has been when there were there were mismatches in expectations or conflicts, between the product owner and the engineering team. Whereas, the PM, it's great if everybody's always agreeing as a PM and an engineering team, but sometimes it's okay to disagree. And that's normal, but, the PO and the engineering team have to be mostly agreeing at the same all the time. Otherwise, it can go downhill pretty quickly, I think.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying this is the truth. I'm just kind of voicing my opinion. What I've noticed from my experience working with engineering teams, working with product owners, and working with business analysts who are kind of proxy product owners, but not really. What I noticed is that team needs a representative.
Yeah.
And that's just my experience. I'm not saying this is a universal truth. But team needs a representative who understands the product, who understands the business, but is still a part of the team. And this being part of the team is really important.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a group spokesperson, right?
Yeah,
they can be assured, and that is done through that reporting mechanism or being a part of the team mechanism, however the organization is structured.
Yeah.
They need to be assured that that person has their best interest in mind. When I was product owner, I was the part of the team. We had a massive reporting. Like I was a consultant, as a matter of fact, from a vendor who was a managing team of people from the company and people from other vendors. Mm-hmm. So reporting went out of the window completely. Yeah. All that mattered was that I was a part of the team. I am part of the engineering team. I understand the technology. I understand the pains that they go through. Yeah. But I also understand the product. I also understand the business. And when I went to bat for them, and it really was, I went to bat for them against the business owner. We didn't have a product organization. We had product owners and we had business owners. Mm-hmm. It was very, very vanilla, a scaled Agile framework, circa 2014, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And what happened was team knew that they can rely on me defending their interests. So if, for example, if a business owner says, we need to do X, and team says, you know what, he's crazy, and this can only be done in this way, and then it's going to take 5 years to build something reasonable. Yeah, I would go back to that person, to the business owner, And I would say what you're asking for is impossible, not because we don't want to do it, but because there are real reasons for that. And I was able to communicate with them on in their language, on their level, but from the technology team standpoint.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a very valuable part. And to me was the lesson why I should be a part of the team, because I wanted to be in the business side. I wanted to become a product manager, but it was very important to me as a product owner to be on the side of the team, because then team trusts me to go and do things for them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point of view about it. I mean, I may have misphrased or misspoken a little bit in saying they always need to agree, which might be, but and I think what I meant more is that they need to be on the same page, in terms of trustworthiness. And
right.
But I think it's I'll say our experience has not been a smooth one with product owners, and that's not for a lack of having great people doing them. It's just we organizationally haven't figured out the best way to incorporate that role into the team. And the one that you described, sounds like a good model that might be worth thinking about. I'll say one thing that is interesting perhaps about, or maybe not interesting, but we tend to have pretty technical product managers on our team or in our company as a whole. We have a very technical buyer and a very technical product. So our PMs are often serving as proxy customers, which is true across the entire industry. But because we have such a technical product, we have fairly technical product managers as well, I'll say, so the empathizing aspect with the engineering team comes naturally to some degree. I feel like I understand how our software is built pretty well, and don't just come and say do it, engineers, I don't care, but that might not always be the case in every industry,
Yes, I agree. It's not. I know for a fact that it's not, and I've seen. I hate to generalize, but in many cases, let's put it this way: in many cases, it derives from where that product manager came from.
Yeah.
As an example, in my organization, I have a lot of product managers who came through as business analysts.
Yeah.
So they're very focused on the processes. They're very focused on using the right frameworks. They're very focused on doing things by the book, because that's how they were brought up. I came from technology. I was a software developer for, 12, 15 years. Then I was managing software development team. And then I kind of sort of should have been a project manager by title, but I ended up doing product management work, product ownership, product management work.
Yeah.
So what happened was I came from a technology side, and I could always, just like you said, empathize with a technology team because I was a technical person, same way you guys are.
Yeah.
And what I noticed was I'm way more, let's say, I'm way more focused on experimentation. Let's try this. Let's try this. Let's try this. Whereas people from a project management background are really risk averse. They don't like experimentation because, oh my God, we're going to fail.
Yeah.
That's, they're scared of failure because my project failed. So it's really, a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
It kind of it depends on what kind of culture you have, what kind of people you have, and where they came from.
Yeah.
So it's a good thing you guys are all technical. You guys are already on the same page. I think that's a very positive thing. You just kind of, need to work, again, from my point of view, not that you've asked, but I'm going to throw that out there. You should definitely think about how you guys build that trust relationship.
Yeah.
And because the whole point of all these processes, the whole point of all these mechanisms being in place is not to really, resolve things when everything's going smoothly, but to resolve conflicts whenever there is one. And there's always going to be conflicts.
Yeah.
And what I think was actually my next question for you would be, how do you define the product manager role? And in not in a formal way. Here's what I mean. Here's what I mean. I usually say a product manager is the one who's not afraid to say no to anybody.
Well, you
And
might be afraid, but you have to do it.
well, it means you're still saying it.
Right,
That's what matters.
Right.
And I've got some slack when you go on a consulting assignment. You can't really say no
Yeah.
to the customer. You have to say, well, there's another point of view on that. But as a product manager, you end up saying no because that's the right answer. That's how you not waste anything, not time, no resources. You're not, pretty things up. No, we're not doing this. Let's focus on something else. And that was really interesting, I guess, experience or approach.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on what is it that a product manager does?
How do you define the product? Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I think it's, having come into product management, fairly late in my career, not late, but, in the mid stage of my career, I'd been working for 13 or 14 years before I started in PM, and, I think what really hit me when I started, was, you're the decider. And I know that sounds like a stupid thing to say, but like ultimately you're the person who's got to define what the next thing is. And that, that can vary from, the aperture on that can vary depending on the stage of the product or the month or whatever, but it's like what I really am trying to do is making the engineering team continue to have a successful product that they're working on and make the product that team is building continue to derive success for the business. So, like you, I came from a pretty technical background. And so I empathize a lot with our engineering team. And, when I was working in software development, the thing I hated the most was not knowing, what my users were doing or what my users thought of the product and, what impact the software I was working on had on the business. And, so I always think about serving both sides of it in terms of I want the business to do as successful as possible, obviously. And, that comes with all of delighting users and, elbowing out the competition and all of those aspects of business, but also, keep the engineering team, having success, I read this book a couple years ago and I've read it again, called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which is one of the best business books I've ever read by Ben Horowitz. And, one of the main things I took away from that book is just thinking about your role as the leader in the product organization as trying to have a sense of responsibility to your colleagues in addition to the responsibility that you have for your users. Because, if you serve your users well, you are also serving your colleagues well. And I try and keep that in mind in every day. Sometimes it's hard when you're in the weeds disagreeing about things, but I try and keep that perspective in mind because, for right or wrong, you're the person making the decisions. That's literally the job that you've been given. So I try and take those decisions seriously so that we don't waste time on things that aren't important and that they have a good impact to all parties involved,
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. Thank you. All right. So let's move on. And I'm looking at my little thing here that we have a list of things to talk about. Mm-hmm. You mentioned something about challenges where you ran beta programs.
Yeah.
And when you were deploying new capabilities of existing product, and that's kind of a very dear topic to me because I live this every day with my current product portfolio, and I lived this in my previous life where I had to run after people who had no idea what I'm offering and why am I even talking to them, asking them to be my beta customers, but I had no idea what the hell beta customer is.
Yeah.
So tell me, what is it that you do in that sense?
So Veracode has a pretty complicated product offering where, we offer, or the product that I work with is effectively taking apart our customers' applications written in a wide variety of software development languages and telling them potential risks that might be involved in that. So, or in the software that they're writing. So the process of adding support for a new language is a complicated one. It requires a really specialized set of skills from just a straight up R&D perspective. But the other thing is that you don't really, your research can only go so far when you're thinking about, when you're trying to determine what risk looks like, until you see real world applications, because, our researchers are excellent and some of the smartest people I've ever met. But at the same time, it's only a couple people's perspective on what bad things that could be going on in user software could be. So we have often run what we call early access programs when we build support for a new language. And one of the ways that we license our software is basically it's a subscription model, and we're releasing features every month. And included in those features that we're releasing is support for new languages. It's not, we don't license by language or only let you do a certain number of things, that based on when you buy your license. If you buy it in January, you get all the features that we release between January and, the next 12 months on your contract, whether it's nothing or whether it's, support for 5 new languages. And the reason I bring this up is because, a core part of making making support for a language successful is to see real world customer applications being tested, so we can understand what those applications look like and make sure that we're reporting risk properly. And seeing that benefits all of our users. This has been a phrase used recently in different circumstances, but it's kind of like a herd immunity type of thing. We're a SaaS offering. We test thousands of applications, and if we see patterns of risk in some applications, if we can use those patterns to inform what we'll see in other users' applications as well. And so the tricky part, though, is starting from zero. If we don't support a new language, such as Python or something, how do you go from supporting or not supporting it to supporting it while also retaining the level of quality that your users are expecting from you? And the way that we've been doing this has been through these early adopter programs where we basically, gauge the interest from customers who we know that are using these languages, and get them to participate in by letting us test their stuff before we roll it out to the broader audience. And I'll say, it's definitely a mixed bag of success, and partly is just a nature of the product. It requires engaging a lot of different members on the customer side, and sometimes it's difficult to find new users if they like our user base is often software developers. So if we've sold into a company that has a Java dev team, a Python dev team, and a .NET dev team, we're engaged great with the Java and the .NET dev team, but we don't know any of the people on the Python dev team because we didn't have anything to offer them, basically, and then suddenly we have something to offer them. We've got to build those relationships within the customer to even find the people to work with, and then, build trust with them in order to get them to understand that we're offering them something new as an experiment, and, meter their expectations. So it can be complicated to find that level of proper engagement. And
Let me ask you a quick question. Well, I can. You guys have a sales force that goes out and builds those relationships, biz dev or sales, or something,
yeah,
one of those two.
yeah. So Veracode is a B2B product, and we have what I'd call as a fairly traditional enterprise sales engagement team. We have.
Right. So when do you guys start? I'm just trying to understand the process. When do you guys start sharing your roadmap with them?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So one thing that's might be unique about Veracode is that we have a very large services organization. I mentioned I came up through that organization.
Yep.
Initially. We have about 100 people on the services organization. So all of our customers have a customer success manager or a program manager, depending on the level of engagement that we that the customer needs, who's our day-to-day point of contact with that user. And we publish a roadmap that's about 9 to 12 months forward looking, and we don't publish it on the public internet, but we'll share it with customers and pretty regularly. Basically, whenever a customer wants to talk about the roadmap, I will gladly talk with them about the roadmap. And that's been one of the ways that we've actually engaged customers, or throughout the course of learning about doing these programs, has been to engage customers in these beta programs or early access programs, via the roadmap, where we say, this is something we're planning to do, release a couple of quarters from now. So start thinking about this if it's something that you're interested in, and start building out that engagement early. And it's established a pattern where we have our users or our program managers, as proxy for our users, often anticipating that there will be an early access program, whether we do one or not, which I guess is a good thing, because it's at least the users are coming to you rather than you having to beg them.
Oh, absolutely.
But at the same time, though, I'll say, it's one thing to say you want to participate, and it's another thing to actually participate,
Right. How much of an effort how much of an effort does it requires from your customer to participate in this early access program?
I mean, it depends, it depends on the product, it depends on the specifics of the given feature, but you try and incorporate them as seamlessly into the existing product as we can. But it kind of will depend. We just released a new feature that required a little bit more engagement, because it was something that was a new thing that we were building that wasn't related to or that was not as incorporated with the rest of our product suite. So that required a lot more deeper engagement with the users than otherwise other programs would have been. But I mean, realistically, the level of engagement tends to be a lot on behalf of the product manager, because as the person defining where the product is going, and most involved in the day-to-day with it, you're the person who can speak about it most intelligently, not the salesperson, not the sales engineer, not the program manager. It's you, and it's sometimes it's you versus 50 customers type of thing. So I used to have weeks where in the heat of an early access program, I've got literally 12 customer calls a week, type of thing, plus doing all my normal day-to-day job of working the backlog and stuff. And
yep, that's normal.
Yeah.
That's normal. So let me ask you, had there ever been the case, or however you want to define this, when you rolled out something in your early access program, and then based on the user feedback, you had to scrap it? Like I said, nope, not going to do it. How did you handle that?
Well, we've definitely slowed the release of things before, because based on user feedback, because like I was alluding to, our research process can only go so far, until you actually hit customers, I'm always reminded of a quote I heard, I think, from Mike Tyson of saying, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. It's like your product make it look great until you actually have a user use it and they tell you how not great it is, so.
Oh yeah. I've definitely been there.
So we've definitely slowed the release of things. My predecessor in this role, I know, definitely canceled a planned release based on some early access. It's hard to say whether that was the right or the wrong decision. I'm not going to hindsight check somebody, who did the job before I had it, but it's definitely happened, I'll say, but the converse has happened is also where we ended up just starting an EA program, and after getting some low-ish level of participation, decided to just release it rather than keep dragging out the beta program, because at a certain point you can say the real way to test the customer response to this is just to stop letting it trickle in and just let people come to it themselves. And that doesn't come with that comes with its own set of problems, because you may have released it too early and had some deficiencies and stuff. But at a certain point, it's kind of like you gotta, I really try and avoid the sunk cost fallacy, but at a certain point you got to say, well, are we going to do this thing or are we not going to do it? So after you've been working on something for 6 months or something, I'm always biased toward just like releasing it and
let's see what happens. Yeah, I agree, and I've been the same. I've been of the same mind most of the time. It's just sometimes certain things you just can't release them, because although you get the data that you want, and I keep repeating this, I've heard it somewhere that there are no failed experiments. There are experiments reaching data.
Yeah.
And I keep saying, but we're going to learn so much even if we fail. There's the other side of the coin here, and that is damage to the brand. If you fail too much in the eyes of a public, of your audience, they will start thinking you're just lower quality product. You're always releasing something, and I've seen this happen to a number of brands where you can, as a product manager, I can clearly see that they're experimenting. As a user, I don't really care what drill I buy as long as it makes holes in the wall.
Yeah,
I don't really care. I'm upset that I can't get things done, or things that are getting done are buggy or had some issues.
Yeah. So, Google is a classic example of that, right? They I
don't know. They're kind of like in the league of their own.
Well, yeah, but sure. They get held up so much as like this, super innovative tech company, which they absolutely are. But at the same time, they will release half-baked experiments, get users to use them, and then kill them.
That's
with apparently no ill effect to the brand, because those users are not actually the users that they care about. But that's a different story.
I'm not sure. I would completely agree with that, and here's why. And again, this may be an edge case, but just hear me out. Back in the day when Google introduced the Google Docs and the whole online editing experience, and I don't know if you remember it, there was this thing called Google Wave.
Oh, of course I do. Yeah, I was on the beta.
Absolutely amazing. And everybody was going crazy. Like literally, people were dropping Microsoft Office like crazy. People were leaving Microsoft Office. Oh, finally, we can do stuff online and for free. We get things for free and online and for free. I mean, it doesn't get any better.
Right.
And it was a pretty big movement and I haven't checked the financials, but I think Microsoft noticed. Let's put it this way. I don't know how much they lost financially, but they've noticed. And
I think that O365 is doing better than G Suite these days, though.
Oh, you just spoiled my story.
So Microsoft noticed and they took action.
Won. Yes, absolutely. Yes, you're right. And that's what I was getting at. Not only they noticed that, they took care of that. They created their own offering.
Yeah.
But the actual trick here is that because Google has this notion of, oh, we're just going to cancel it. Oh, you know what? You have, 6 months to get out of it, and we're just going to cancel it. Yep. Once something reasonably comparable was available from Microsoft, everybody ran back. And that is a kind of Google is the most innovative company. They probably spend on innovation more than the next 5 companies in a row, but you just can't trust your business continuity on the company that just cancels things out just because.
Yeah.
And that's why Google Docs is Google Docs, and O365 is basically every business I know is either using Microsoft Office or Office 365 or something of that nature.
Yeah.
Almost no one uses Google Docs, and it's more or less a stagnant product at the moment. I'm using Google Docs for some of my personal stuff. I barely see any improvement from what was there 3-5 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's probably not core to the business, though. I mean, if you look at their, well, this isn't a Google podcast, but it's not the core of their growth. It's not a core corner of their business.
Right, but it's a product. I mean, it's a product. It's a very interesting product. Yeah. Given that Microsoft Office has been around for ages, since last century, right? Yeah. They came in, they disrupted the industry. They've offered something completely new and different, and they failed to capture the momentum because their product vision was off. And Microsoft kind of did the right thing. They let Google innovate. They picked up the right pieces, what worked, skipped what didn't work, and kaboom! Now you're golden.
Well, and it shows the advantage of already having the large install base. I mean, the key feature of O365 is how easy it is to switch from an existing implementation that's not using 365 to using it. It's a pretty easy migration, that versus ripping everything out and turning it into a new stack. It shows how if you've got a core business, it's easier to noodle and innovate on top of it than be the disruptor.
Yep, I completely agree. Yep. So, any other challenges except for what you've mentioned? Any other challenges with your beta customers, beta programs? Any other lessons learned that you can share?
I think just I think the core thing that I've learned through the course of doing it, and I've been doing them for several years now, probably 1 or 2 a year regularly, has been that you got to decide how long you're going to let something run and have a launch plan. Even if that launch plan is just like simple of it's like, where this is going to run for 3 months and at the end of 3 months it's GA, where I've personally gotten tripped up and where I've seen other products gotten tripped up, whether it's other products that we've experimented with in our company or at other companies has been just a poorly defined exit criteria, and you just got to stick to your guns on it. And I think, going back to going back to what I was saying earlier about thinking about your relationship with the engineering team and doing good by them. I think that, for the, for the good of that relationship, you need to, have a plan to release it, or have a clear plan or have a clear explanation why you're not going to release it and go in with the expectation that it might be an experiment. But, if you go down the path of saying, here's a new feature we're building and we're going to roll it out for a quarter and then it will be released for everybody at the end of that quarter, you should execute on that. If you say you're going to execute on that and then you don't, that'll lose confidence in, that will lose confidence of many of your colleagues potentially, as well as your customers, just because, they may not know if they can trust that it's going to be released. I had in the most recent early access program I was just running, one of the customers I was speaking with in it was a really eye-opening thing that he said to me, which was, he was like, well, I didn't want to start using it and like it if I wasn't sure that you guys were going to release it or not. And, and I was like, yeah, man, of course we're releasing it. I got like 12-month backlog plan for this thing. And he's like, oh, well, that's all I needed to hear. And then became one of our biggest users of it, but in his mind, he wasn't really sure. And didn't, so just being clear with your users and being clear with your colleagues that that's something, that's what the plan is, and do your best to execute on that plan is pretty important.
Yeah, makes sense. I've lived through a couple of products that had that notion of promising and not releasing.
Yeah.
And I've lived through a product that was kind of the opposite. We didn't say anything, and then, oh, here's something, or here's something else, here's something else. And I was like, oh my God, how you guys doing? So yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
That's useful, interesting, and useful.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this, because we're coming up on time pretty soon, and this kind of ties in with what you've been saying. How do you measure whether your initiative, your capability, feature, or the whole product is successful?
Mm-hmm.
How do you know what is your measure of success?
So this is actually a question that when I was interviewing for my the job as a product manager with zero product management experiment, I was asked in the interview, and by the VP of the product team, and I gave sort of my naive answer of are your users happy with you, or that kind of thing, and she was like, nah, it's the ultimate arbiter of success is how's the revenue looking from it, and I think that's true in many cases. It's not true in 100% of the cases. It really depends on the scope of the product that you're responsible for. But I would say it's a pretty good proxy of a lot of things, I'll say. And I would say, to the people I know who are in product management roles that may not have direct bookings coming into their product or whatever, try and understand the impact that what you're working on has to those bookings. And if you can see that those bookings moving in the right direction, try and determine if you're contributing to that, in whatever is the appropriate metric for that particular product. I have perhaps the quote unquote easy perspective on this, of that, my product is sold by licenses. So I have a pretty easy metric of success. If we sell more licenses this year than last year, it's doing okay, but then, you can look at it, at the sort of the smaller scale level of, we have a lot of different individual capabilities within that product. And I would say, when we release support for certain features within that, to try and define, where you'd like to see the adoption of it within a couple of quarters, or, by the end of the next fiscal year, or whatever the time frame that you decide is, and, do what you can to try and achieve that. But I'd say unless you're working in a nonprofit or something,
actually, no. I see where you're going with this. I see where you're going with this. Just again, and I think I just made that example last episode. I don't remember the product. So we had a core product offering, and I was developing a bunch of products around it, kind of complementary / doing something in parallel to the core product. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we were thinking would be a commercial product was some sort of an integration. I'm trying not to go too deep into details, but mm-hmm. It's a retail point of sale, so it needs inventory to function. And we've built an integration to pull in that inventory without manual input. Mm-hmm. Pretty obvious solution, pretty obvious everything, yet no one in the market has done that before. So we were the first, and we gave that away we didn't charge a single cent for it because it did not make any sense to charge for it. Yeah. Although we were a for-profit company, it didn't make any sense to charge for it, but it gave us a huge competitive advantage.
Yeah.
And it resulted in a huge improvement in retention.
Yeah.
So I always say, and I was actually, if I was interviewing you, I would actually like your first answer better. I understand you weren't able to expand on it and actually say things like, hey, it's a good proxy measure for ROI or customer retention or whatnot. But ultimately, you're right. If your customers are happy, then they keep paying you, keep licensing your product, keep paying you for your product, and everything goes well. Yeah. If they're not happy and you're not the only game in town, which is what usually happens, then they take their business somewhere else, and your ROI doesn't look that pretty anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's we're in this. We're actually just have released literally last week, which is why I have time for a podcast now. Release a new product which we're not charging for. It's included with our existing licenses. So our measure of success for that is going to be user adoption.
Right.
But that's, again, it's kind of like the feature that you just described, where it's a delighter, and it will help, retain customers. It could be a differentiator when looking at competition, and, ultimately we'll still have a maybe more difficult to directly measure, but still hopefully attributable effect on the success of the product as a whole, financially and otherwise,
Yep.
And, I think sense. And I love company culture and, fun organizations as much as everybody else. And, this sounds like a stuffed shirt thing to say, which I'm totally not, but, it's like, I think it's always important to keep in mind. And I think this is something that became even more clear to me just through the learning process of being involved in acquisitions, is like, you got to keep your numbers in mind, because, whether you're thinking about it actively or not, someone's thinking about your numbers. So it's best to not be surprised about it, whether you're a public company and it's your shareholders, or whether you're a early stage startup and it's, you're one investor, somebody's thinking about how your performance is, because, part of working in high tech, or a part of working in a capitalistic global economy is, the desire to have a return on investment. And that's why we have admittedly very privileged position of getting, a pretty high paid job working in a pretty interesting industry. We're all working from home, still working in the tech business, and that doesn't come by default. It comes by being successful financially as part of what you're working on.
That part I can totally agree with. Yeah. So as we coming up at almost at the end of the show, I'm trying to wrap up.
Yeah.
Are there any questions for me? And that's my regular thing. I always ask this question at the end. If you have any questions for me, hopefully I will be able to answer it in a couple of minutes. So no questions about how to solve the world hunger or anything like that. Something. Let's do something simple and about product management.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think just from what I read and I've shared my point of view on this, and a lot of questions I see people asking on the blogs or the Twitter sphere or whatever you want to call it is, how do people get into product management? And which I think is an interesting question to ask, but I think maybe a question that might be more interesting to ask would be like, what do you think people should expect to get out of going into product management?
Oh, that's a good one, because first of all, no one ever asked me this before, and second, I didn't think of that.
Yeah.
How come I didn't think of that? So, I would imagine I can only speak for myself. I would imagine there would be some people that would agree with this. What I personally like is solving problems. And back in the day when I had my own business, I never said, we were in web design or we were in web development. I was always saying something very weird like, we're solving business problems with technology.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I ended up doing, being a product manager.
Yeah.
So for me, it's this challenge of finding another problem to solve and figuring out how to solve it, and then actually carrying that solution from an idea where I used to be stuck at to the actual solution, to the execution of that solution, to taking something to the market so that people can use it. Like in one of the previous jobs, I built a product. It was actually a prototype. I built a prototype together with another developer. We kind of put it together using rapid application development technology, not even, true coding to speak of. We kind of put it all together. We showed it to a director of the department that thing was supposed to be working at. And she liked it. She was like, yeah, okay. And 2 weeks later, we found out that since it was a prototype, it wasn't even alpha or beta, there's no security, just, a demo of functions that was there. So she quietly introduced it to the whole department, about a couple of hundred people, and about 50 of them started using it. So I log into my own system and I found 50 users actively throwing production data into it. And it was, first of all, it was mind boggling. Second, I got a lot of flack for it. And at the end of the day, that was like, I came home when I learned that. I understood that, everybody's going to start demanding my head because it was a highly regulated environment. Right. But I came home and I for some reason, I felt better than ever before. Felt very proud of myself. And the reason why I felt very proud of myself was because I found the solution so good. Well, not me personally, we as a team, but as a product manager, I found the solution to a problem. The solution was so good that people were okay with using barely functioning prototype.
Right.
Instead of whatever the hell they used before. So it was that feeling of, fulfillment, that feeling of happiness is what I keep feeling as I work on other products and finding these other solutions. That's kind of a thing for me. So that's why I keep doing product management, because I've switched a few careers in my life. Yeah. I love this one probably more than anything I've done before.
Yeah. I'm right where with you. And I mean, I think, I found the most enthusiastic PMs to be those who came to it after having been in other roles, because you've seen multiple sides of the fence, versus like, if you're 23 or, you may not have a lot of perspective on what, on if this is something that you really, are I hate this word, are passionate about, or that you're, that is going to be satisfying for you personally, it's an interesting job and a lot of people want to do it. And I think it's a great opportunity to learn about business and technology at the same time, but that may not be what you want to do with your life. And, when you start the job when you're 35 or 40, like I started when I was 35 as a product manager, and I'm like, this is, I'm glad that I'm doing this now versus when I was younger, because I feel like I've got a little bit, you can inherit the perspective of having done a lot of different other things and see the value of being able to take things across the finish line and satisfy your users and stuff.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I completely agree. And I keep seeing someone on social media, mainly Quora. I do a lot of Quora whoring, and one of the things I see there is like, well, I'm going to get an MBA and become a product manager. Is that a good enough path, or should I just go straight to product management without the MBA? And I'm looking at these guys, and I understand they're college kids. They're trying to map out the path for their career, but product management is not what you want. do something else. I don't know. Open your own shoe store.
Yeah. I mean,
go hike a mountain.
And I would say to anybody who's listening, and I'm tempted to respond to people who ask these questions on Reddit or Quora or whatever, I'll say, like, as the person on the other side of the table who'd be interviewing you for that role, I'm more interested in, like, the perspective you're bringing, not necessarily if you've got an MBA or whatever. It's like how is your perspective going to help the success of our business, and are you going to be able to empathize with our users and help them succeed by building something that they need, and therefore helping us to succeed. MBAs are great, and one of my best mentors in my career came to PM after having been gone through his MBA program, but like it's just a tool in the toolbox. It helps you learn that business aspect, but it's not the end all be all, that's for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. All right, we're at the end. Thank you so much for being on this episode. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a very good conversation. I appreciate you having me.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Jon, and until the next time. You've been listening to The Real World Product Management, and I've been your host, Vlad Grubman. Until the next time.